Naval aviation is the application of military air power by navies, whether from warships that embark aircraft, or land bases. In contrast, maritime aviation is the operation of aircraft in a maritime role, under the command of non-naval forces such as an Air Force or a Coast Guard. An exception to this is the United States Coast Guard, which is considered part of U.S. naval aviation. In addition, the United States Marine Corps is part of the United States Department of the Navy and one of its naval services. The forces aircraft and aviation personnel are also considered part of U.S. naval aviation, whether based afloat or ashore. Naval aviation is typically projected to a position nearer the target by way of an aircraft carrier. Carrier-based aircraft must be sturdy enough to withstand demanding carrier operations. They must be able to launch in a short distance and be sturdy and flexible enough to come to a sudden stop on a pitching flight deck. They typically have robust folding mechanisms that allow higher numbers of them to be stored in below-deck hangars and small spaces on flight decks. These aircraft are designed for many purposes, including air-to-air combat, surface attack, submarine attack, search and rescue, materiel transport, weather observation, reconnaissance and wide-area command and control duties. History. Establishment. Early experiments on the use of kites for naval reconnaissance took place in 1903 at Woolwich Common for the Admiralty. Samuel Franklin Cody demonstrated the capabilities of his 8-foot-long black kite, and it was proposed for use as either a mechanism to hold up wires for wireless communications, or as a manned reconnaissance device that would give the viewer the advantage of considerable height. In 1908, Prime Minister H. Asquith approved the formation of an aerial subcommittee of the Committee of Imperial Defense to investigate the potential for naval aviation. In 1909, this body accepted the proposal of Captain Reginald Bacon made to the first Sea Lord Sir John Fisher that rigid airships should be constructed for the Royal Navy to be used for reconnaissance. This resulted in the construction of Mayfly in 1909, the first air component of the Navy to become operational, and the genesis of modern naval aviation. The first pilots for the Royal Navy were transferred from the Royal Aero Club in June 1910 along with 2 aircraft with which to train new pilots, and an airfield at Eastchurch became the Naval Flying School, the first such facility in the world. 200 applications were received, and 4 were accepted. Lieutenant C.R. Sampson, Lieutenant A.M. Longmore, Lieutenant A. Gregory and Captain D.L. Gerard RMLI. The French also established a naval aviation capability in 1910 with the establishment of the Service Aeronautique and the first flight training schools. U.S. naval aviation began with pioneer aviator Glenn Curtis, who contracted with the Navy to demonstrate that airplanes could take off from and land aboard ships at sea. One of his pilots, Eugene Ely, took off from the U.S. Birmingham, anchored off the Virginia coast in November 1910. 2 months later, Ely landed aboard another cruiser, US Pennsylvania, in San Francisco Bay, proving the concept of shipboard operations. However, the platforms erected on those vessels were temporary measures. The U.S. Navy and Glenn Curtis experienced 2 firsts during January 1911. On the 27th of January, Curtis flew the first seaplane from the water at San Diego Bay, and the next day U.S. Navy Lt. Theodore G. Ellison, a student at the nearby Curtis School, took off in a Curtis Grasscutter plane to become the first naval aviator. $25,000 was appropriated for the Bureau of Navigation to purchase 3 airplanes, and in the spring of 1911 4 additional officers were trained as pilots by the Wright brothers and Curtis. A camp with a primitive landing field was established on the Severn River at Greenbury Point, near Annapolis, Maryland. The group expanded with the addition of 6 aviators in 1912 and 5 in 1913, from both the Navy and Marine Corps, and conducted maneuvers with the fleet from the battleship Mississippi, designated as the Navy's aviation ship. Meanwhile, Captain Henry C. Mustine successfully tested the concept of the catapult launch in August 1912, and in 1915 made the first catapult launching from a ship underway. The first permanent naval air station was established at Pensacola, Florida, in January 1914, with Mustine as its commanding officer, on April 24 of that year, and for a period of approximately 45 days afterward. 5 float planes and flying boats flown by 10 aviators operated from the Mississippi and the cruiser Birmingham off Veracruz and Tampico, Mexico, respectively, conducting reconnaissance for troops ashore in the wake of the Tampico affair. In January 1912, the British battleship HMS Africa took part in aircraft experiments at Sheerness. She was fitted for flying off aircraft with a 100-foot downward sloping runway which was installed on her foredeck, running over her forward 12-inch turret from her forebridge to her bows, and equipped with rails to guide the aircraft. The Gnome-engine short improved S-27 S-38 pusher seaplane piloted by Lieutenant Charles Sampson became the first British aircraft to take off from a ship while at anchor in the River Medway. On the 10th of January 1912, Africa then transferred her flight equipment to her sister ship Hibernia. In May 1912, with Commander Sampson again flying the S-38, the first ever instance of an aircraft to take off from a ship which was underway occurred. Hibernia steamed at 10.5 knots at the Royal Fleet Review in Weymouth Bay, England. Hibernia then transferred her aviation equipment to Battleship London. Based on these experiments, the Royal Navy concluded that aircraft were useful aboard ship for spotting and other purposes, but that interference with the firing of guns caused by the runway built over the foredeck and the danger and impracticality of recovering seaplanes that alighted in the water in anything but calm weather more than offset the desirability of having airplanes aboard. In 1912, the nascent Naval Air Detachment in the United Kingdom was amalgamated to form the Royal Flying Corps, and in 1913 a seaplane base on the Isle of Grain, an airship base at Kings North, and 8 new airfields were approved for construction. The first aircraft participation in naval maneuvers took place in 1913 with the cruiser Hermes converted into a seaplane carrier. In 1914, naval aviation was split again, and became the Royal Naval Air Service. However, shipboard naval aviation had begun in the Royal Navy, and would become a major part of fleet operations by 1917. Other early operators of seaplanes were Germany, within its marine flyger abtailing naval aviation units within the Kaiserliche Marine, and Russia. The Japanese established the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, modeled on the RNAS, in 1913. On the 24th of January 1913 came the first wartime naval aviation inter-service cooperation mission. Greek pilots on a seaplane observed and drew a diagram of the positions of the Turkish fleet against which they dropped 4 bombs. This event was widely commented upon in the press, both Greek and international. World War I. At the outbreak of war, the Royal Naval Air Service had 93 aircraft, 6 airships, 2 balloons and 727 personnel, making it larger than the Royal Flying Corps. The main roles of the RNAS were fleet reconnaissance, patrolling coasts for enemy ships and submarines, attacking enemy coastal territory and defending Britain from enemy air raids, along with deployment along the Western Front. In 1914, the first aerial torpedo was dropped in trials performed in a short folder by Lieutenant Arthur Longmore, and in August 1915, a short Type 184 piloted by Flight Commander Charles H. K. Edmonds from HMS Ben Mikri sank a Turkish supply ship in the Sea of Marmara with a 14-inch diameter, 810-pound torpedo. The first strike from a seaplane carrier against a land target as well as a sea target took place in September 1914 when the Imperial Japanese Navy carrier Wakamiya conducted ship-launched air raids from Kiaochao Bay during the Battle of Tsingtao in China. The 4 Morris Farman seaplanes bombarded German-held land targets and damaged a German mine layer in the Tsingtao Peninsula from September until the 6th of November 1914, when the Germans surrendered. On the Western Front, the first naval air raid occurred on the 25th of December 1914 when 12 seaplanes from HMS Engadine, Riviera and Empress attacked the Zeppelin base at Cuxhaven. The raid was not a complete success owing to suboptimal weather conditions, including fog and low cloud, but the raid was able to conclusively demonstrate the feasibility of air-to-land strikes from a naval platform. Development of the aircraft carrier. The need for a more mobile strike capacity led to the development of the aircraft carrier, the backbone of modern naval aviation. HMS Ark Royal was the first purpose-built seaplane carrier and was also arguably the first modern aircraft carrier. She was originally laid down as a merchant ship, but was converted on the building stocks to be a hybrid airplane-seaplane carrier with a launch platform and the capacity to hold up to 4 wheeled aircraft. Launched on 5 September 1914, she served in the Dardanelles campaign and throughout World War I. During World War I, the Royal Navy also used HMS Furious to experiment with the use of wheeled aircraft on ships. This ship was reconstructed 3 times between 1915 and 1925. First, while still under construction, it was modified to receive a flight deck on the foredeck. In 1917 it was reconstructed with separate flight decks fore and after the superstructure. Then finally, after the war, it was heavily reconstructed with a 3/4 length main flight deck, and a low-level takeoff-only flight deck on the foredeck. On the 2nd of August 1917, Squadron Commander East H. Dunning, Royal Navy, landed his Sopwith Pup aircraft on HMS Furious in Scapa Flow, Orkney, becoming the first person to land a plane on a moving ship. He was killed 5 days later during another landing on Furious. HMS Arga was converted from an ocean liner and became the first example of what is now the standard pattern of aircraft carrier, with a full-length flight deck that allowed wheeled aircraft to take off and land. After commissioning, the ship was heavily involved for several years in the development of the optimum design for other aircraft carriers. Argus also evaluated various types of arresting gear, general procedures needed to operate a number of aircraft in concert, and fleet tactics. The Tonde raid, a British bombing raid against the Imperial German Navy's airship base at Tonde, Denmark, was the first attack in history made by aircraft flying from a carrier flight deck, with 7 Sopwith Camels launched from HMS Furious. For the loss of 1 man, the British destroyed 2 German Zeppelins, L-54 and L-60, and a captive balloon. Interwar period. Genuine aircraft carriers did not emerge beyond Britain until the early 1920s. The Japanese Hosho was the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, although the initial plans for the HMS Hermes began sooner. Both Hosho and Hermes initially boasted the two most distinctive features of a modern aircraft carrier: a full-length flight deck and a starboard side control tower island. Both continued to be adjusted in the light of further experimentation and experience. However, the Hosho even opted to remove its island entirely in favor of a less obstructed flight deck and improved pilot visibility. Instead, Japanese carriers opted to control the flight operations from a platform extending from the side of the flight deck. In the United States, Admiral William Benson attempted to entirely dissolve the U.S.'s naval aeronautics program in 1919. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Roosevelt and others succeeded in maintaining it, but the service continued to support battleship-based doctrines. To counter Billy Mitchell's campaign to establish a separate Department of Aeronautics, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels ordered a rigged test against the U.S. Indiana in 1920, which reached the conclusion that the entire experiment pointed to the improbability of a modern battleship being either destroyed or completely put out of action by aerial bombs. Investigation by the New York Tribune that discovered the rigging led to congressional resolutions compelling more honest studies. The sinking of the SMS Ostfriesland involved violating the Navy's rules of engagement but completely vindicated Mitchell to the public. Some men, such as Captain William A. Moffett, saw the publicity stunt as a means to increase funding and support for the Navy's aircraft carrier projects. Moffett was sure that he had to move decisively in order to avoid having his fleet air arm fall into the hands of a proposed combined land-sea air force which took care of all the United States' air power needs. Moffett supervised the development of naval air tactics throughout the 1920s. The first aircraft carrier entered the U.S. fleet with the conversion of the Collier-US Jupiter and its recommissioning as the Langley in 1922. Many British naval vessels carried floatplanes, seaplanes or amphibians for reconnaissance and spotting. 2 to 4 on battleships are battlecruisers and 1 on cruisers. The aircraft, a Fairey Sea Fox or later a Supermarine Walrus, were catapult-launched and landed on the sea alongside for recovery by crane. Several submarine aircraft carriers were built by Japan, each carrying 1 floatplane, which did not prove effective in war. The French Navy built 1 large submarine, the Surcouf, which also carried 1 floatplane, and was also not effective in war. World War II saw the emergence of naval aviation as the decisive element in the war at sea. The principal users were Japan, United States and Britain. Germany, the Soviet Union, France and Italy had a lesser involvement. Soviet naval aviation was mostly organized as land-based coast defense force. During the course of the war, seaborne aircraft were used in fleet actions at sea, strikes against naval units in port, support of ground forces and anti-submarine warfare. Carrier-based aircraft were specialized as dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Surface-based aircraft such as the PBY Catalina helped finding submarines and surface fleets. In World War II, the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the most powerful naval offensive weapons system as battles between fleets were increasingly fought out of gun range by aircraft. The Japanese Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, was first turned back by light escort carrier aircraft and later sunk lacking its own air cover. In the Doolittle raid of 1942, the U.S. Navy launched Air Force medium bombers on one-way missions to bomb Tokyo. All were lost to fuel exhaustion after bombing the targets, and the experiment was not repeated. Smaller carriers were built in large numbers to escort slow cargo convoys or supplement fast carriers. Aircraft for observation or light raids were also carried by battleships and cruisers, while blimps were used to search for attack submarines. Experience showed that there was a need for widespread use of aircraft which could not be met quickly enough by building new fleet aircraft carriers. This was particularly true in the North Atlantic, where convoys were highly vulnerable to U-boat attack. The British authorities used unorthodox, temporary, but effective means of giving air protection such as camships and merchant aircraft carriers. Merchant ships modified to carry a small number of aircraft. The solution to the problem were large numbers of mass-produced merchant hulls converted into escort aircraft carriers. These basic vessels, unsuited to fleet action by the capacity, speed and vulnerability, nevertheless provided air cover where it was needed. The Royal Navy had observed the impact of naval aviation and, obliged to prioritize the use of resources, abandoned battleships as the mainstay of the fleet. HMS Vanguard was therefore the last British battleship, and her sisters were cancelled. The United States had already instigated a large construction program, but these large ships were mainly used as anti-aircraft batteries or for shore bombardment. Other actions involving naval aviation included Battle of the Atlantic. Aircraft carried by low-cost escort carriers were used for anti-submarine patrol, defense, and attack. At the start of the Pacific War in 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft sank many U.S. warships at Pearl Harbor, and land-based aircraft sank 2 large British warships. Engagements between Japanese and American naval fleets were then conducted largely or entirely by aircraft. Examples include the battles of Coral Sea, Midway, Bismarck Sea and Philippine Sea. Battle of Leyte Gulf, with the first appearance of kamikazes, perhaps the largest naval battle in history. Japan's last carriers and pilots are deliberately sacrificed. A battleship is sunk by aircraft. Operation Tango demonstrated U.S. air supremacy in the Pacific theater by this stage in the war, and the vulnerability of surface ships without air cover to aerial attack. Post-war developments. Jet aircraft were used on aircraft carriers after the war. The first jet landing on a carrier was made by LTCDR Eric Winkle Brown, who landed on HMS Ocean in the specially modified de Havilland Vampire LZ 551G on 3 December 1945. Following the introduction of angled flight decks, jets were operating from carriers by the mid-1950s. An important development of the early 1950s was the British invention of the angled flight deck by Captain D.R.F. Campbell RN in conjunction with Lewis Boddington of the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The runway was canted at an angle of a few degrees from the longitudinal axis of the ship. If an aircraft missed the arrestor cables, the pilot only needed to increase engine power to maximum to get airborne again, and would not hit the parked aircraft because the angled deck pointed out over the sea. The angled flight deck was first tested on HMS Triumph by painting angled deck markings onto the centerline flight deck for touch-and-go landings. The modern steam-powered catapult, powered by steam from the ship's boilers or reactors, was invented by Commander C. Mitchell of the Royal Naval Reserve. It was widely adopted following trials on HMS Perseus between 1950 and 1952, which showed it to be more powerful and reliable than the hydraulic catapults which had been introduced in the 1940s. The first optical landing system, the mirror landing aid, was invented by Lieutenant Commander H.C.N. guard.An. The first trials of a mirror landing site were conducted on HMS Illustrious in 1952. The U.S. Navy built the first aircraft carrier to be powered by nuclear reactors. U.S. Enterprise was powered by nuclear reactors and was the second surface warship to be powered in this way. The post-war years also saw the development of the helicopter, with a variety of useful roles and mission capability aboard aircraft carriers. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the United Kingdom and the United States converted some older carriers into commando carriers, a landing platform helicopters, seagoing helicopter airfields like HMS Bulwark, to mitigate the expensive connotations of the term aircraft carrier. The new Invincible-class carriers were originally designated as through-deck cruisers, and were initially to operate as helicopter-only craft escort carriers. The arrival of the Sea Harrier VTOL SDOVL fast jet meant they could carry fixed-wing aircraft, despite the short flight deck. The British also introduced the ski jump ramp as an alternative to contemporary catapult systems. As the Royal Navy retired or sold the last of its World War II-era carriers, they were replaced with smaller ships designed to operate helicopters and the VSDOVL Sea Harrier jet. The ski jump gave the Harriers an enhanced SDOVL capability, allowing them to take off with heavier payloads. In 2013, the U.S. Navy completed the first successful catapult launch and arrested landing of an unmanned aerial vehicle aboard an aircraft carrier. After a decade of research and planning, the U.S. Navy has been testing the integration of UAVs with carrier-based forces since 2013, using the experimental Northrop Grumman X-47B, and is working to procure a fleet of carrier-based UAVs, referred to as the Unmanned Carrier-Launched Airborne Surveillance and Strike System. Roles: Naval aviation forces primarily perform naval roles at sea. However, they are also used for other tasks which vary between states. Common roles for such forces include strategic projection. Carrier-based naval aviation provides a country's seagoing forces with air cover over areas that may not be reachable by land-based aircraft, giving them a considerable advantage over navies composed primarily of surface combatants. In the case of the United States Navy during and after the Cold War, virtual command of the sea in many of the world's waterways allowed it to deploy aircraft carriers and project air power almost anywhere on the globe. By operating from international waters, U.S. carriers can bypass the need for conventional air bases or overflight rights, both of which can be politically difficult to acquire. Anti-submarine warfare. During the Cold War, the navies of NATO faced a significant threat from Soviet submarine forces, specifically Soviet Navy SSN and SSGN assets. This resulted in the development and deployment of light aircraft carriers with major anti-submarine warfare capabilities by European NATO navies. One of the most effective weapons against submarines is the ASW helicopter, several of which could be based on these light ships. These carriers are typically around 20,000 tons displacement and carry a mix of ASW helicopters and BAE Sea Harrier or Harrier 2V SDOL aircraft. Land-based maritime patrol aircraft are also useful in this role, since they can operate independently of aircraft carriers. Anti-surface warfare. Aircraft operated by navies are also used in the anti-surface warfare role to attack enemy ships and other surface combatants. This is generally conducted using air-launched anti-ship missiles. Amphibious warfare. Naval aviation is also used as part of amphibious warfare. Aircraft based on naval ships provide support to Marines and other forces performing amphibious landings. Ship-based aircraft may also be used to support amphibious forces as they move inland. Maritime patrol. Naval aircraft are used for various maritime patrol missions, such as reconnaissance, search and rescue, and maritime law enforcement. Vertical replenishment. Vertical replenishment, or VERTREP, is a method of supplying naval vessels at sea by helicopter. This means moving cargo and supplies from supply ships to the flight decks of other naval vessels, using naval helicopters. Disaster relief. Naval aircraft are used to airlift supplies, insert specialized personnel, and evacuate persons in distress in the aftermath of natural disasters. Naval aircraft are vital in cases where traditional infrastructure to provide relief are destroyed or overtaxed in the wake of a disaster, such as when a region's airport is destroyed or overcrowded and the region cannot be effectively accessed by road or helicopter. The capability of ships to provide clean, fresh water which can be transported by helicopter to affected areas is also valuable. Naval aircraft played an important part in providing relief in the wake of the 2010 Haiti earthquake and Typhoon Haiyan. Naval aviation branches. Current naval aviation's Air Division of the Royal Thai Navy. Air Wing 6, Argentine Naval Aviation, Brazilian Naval Aviation, Chilean Naval Aviation, Fleet Air Arm, French Naval Aviation, Indian Naval Air Arm, Islamic Republic of Iran Navy Aviation, Marinefliga, Mexican Naval Aviation, Pakistan Naval Air Arm, People's Liberation Army Naval Air Force, Peruvian Naval Aviation, Polish Naval Aviation, Republic of China Naval Aviation Command, Russian Naval Aviation, Turkish Naval Aviation, United States Marine Corps Aviation, United States Naval Air Forces. Since 1975, the Royal Canadian Navy's naval aviation arm is operated by the Royal Canadian Air Force, former Naval Aviation's Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Soviet Naval Aviation.